Góðan dag, velkomin á málstofu Hafrannsóknastofnunar. Við erum búin að vera svolítið heppin undanfarið að það eru að koma gestir með áhugaverð erindi. Ég veit ekki hvort við getum kallað þennan fyrirlesar gest. Hann er 25% starfsmaður Hafrannsóknastofnunar frá og með deginum í gær eða fyrrdag eða eitthvað. Yes. En það er þess að Dr. Sam DuPont sem er prófessor við Háskólann í Gautaborg í Svíþjóð og þar hefur hann leitt öflugt vísindastarf við rannsóknarstöðina í Kristineberg og hefur birt fleiri en 300 vísindagreinar sem eiga það sameiginlegt að lýsa niðurstöðum rannsókna á áhrifum súrnun sjávars auk annarra álagsþátta. Og undanfarin ár hefur hann lagt mikla áherslu á að miðla þessari þekkingu til stjórnvalda gegnum til dæmis IPCC og fleiri vísindanefndir á alþjóðavettvangi. Og eins og ég sagði áðan þá mun hann starfa við Hafrannsóknastofnun næstu 2 árin að aðstoða okkur einmitt að hluta til í því. Sam, I just introduced you and I think I put a good light on you, especially in relation to your life-changing decision that you made to join the institute. And you know what that means? It's not turning back. It says here in the text it's only for 2 years. I see you in 3 years.
That's exactly what happened in Sweden. I was going there for 18 months.
Exactly. Yeah. So very welcome. The floor is yours.
Yeah, life has this interesting twist, like when I was really not planning to stay more than 18 months in this beautiful place, and 2 kids, 20 years now, but I'm ready for the next adventure, so I'm taking the bait, and great. So thanks for coming and taking the time to see this presentation. So I was not really sure what to do with the presentation today. So I made a little bit of an introduction of myself and a conversation about what science can provide to actually fix some of the issues we have today. But first, I wanted just to show you a beautiful picture of where I'm mostly based. So that's the Kristineberg Marine Station. That's the 3rd oldest marine station in the world. So soon it's going to be 150 years. And traditionally, it was developed by the Academy of Science. But then a few years ago, when the money was tight, they decided we don't want to run the marine station anymore. So the University of Gothenburg took over. But interestingly enough, decided last year that they didn't want the marine station either. So it was really close to close it, which would have been really embarrassing, I think, because it's history, it's a lot of data, a lot of things. But we've been really lucky now that the Swedish Polar Research Secretariat decided to take over with still the presence of the University of Gothenburg there. So now it's going to be more like a center. So we have a future, which is really great. So I can leave happy now, I think, because we had to work really hard to find a new owner. And basically, originally, I'm a botanist, actually. So I studied in Belgium. I'm a botanist, but I moved to marine biology later. And now my research focused on basically ecophysiology of change. So I'm interested in what's happening inside an organism when things change around it. It could be naturally, it could be stressors, it could be pollution, and so on. I have a teaching position, so I'm also teaching there on ecology, evolution, and ocean literacy, kind of the main thing I'm teaching. And over the last 5-10 years, I've been really involved in communication, working on climate change. I thought it's really important to be efficient in the way we communicate our science to different stakeholders. And more recently, I took the position of vice director for the station, and that's really because we want to keep the station alive, and that requires international collaboration. It's a really small place, so we depend on people coming to actually survive. And then the last part is over the last 4 years, I worked as consultant for the Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center of the IAEA in Monaco. And that was a completely different kind of work. It was capacity development. So what we were doing there was gather money and make evaluation and developing courses, instrumentation. So going to developing countries and develop their capacity for ocean acidification science mostly, but also multiple stressors and so on. But that's over now, so I stopped this month, and now that I start a new adventure, which is coming regularly here and work together with you on developing like a scientific strategy on how to basically address ocean acidification at the country level, but also hopefully play and have the chance to do science. I was just visiting the marine station a few days ago, and it's really cool. So that's me in a nutshell. So I hope that we'll have the chance to talk with all of you in more detail later. But basically, we are here because, we care. I think that's the important part. We know that we live on the blue planet. I think I rather prefer that picture because it really more represents actually what the situation is. Like we basically are highly depending on the ocean for many things. And I was together with Aina like a few weeks ago in Ischia in Italy for a course. And then I had a few hours free, so I went to the archaeological museum and I saw this beautiful statue of Oceanus, which is, one of the god of the ocean, or the original Titan. And I really liked it because it was basically carrying this cornucopia, which is a good symbol that actually the ocean is providing so much for us. And it's providing like so many different services. And, it's from the air we breathe, like the many potential substances and processes in the ocean that are untapped today. Seafood, of course, there are a lot of cultural values. Biodiversity, of course, is unique in the ocean, coastal protection, and also regulating the climate. So basically, the ocean, doesn't matter where you live, has a huge impact on you. The problem is that a lot of people don't know that. And often the ocean is associated with money, like it's basically we extract and collect stuff from the ocean. But there is a movement now that is actually showing that it's not only about provisioning, it's also about health. The ocean is impacting on health in many different ways. So I have a question for you first, like what is the worst chronic disease that the humanity is facing today? So what are we dying the most of when it comes to chronic disease? So it used to be virus and bacteria, but it's kind of, okay now, it's all fixed. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, I think it's linked a little bit. Cancer is linked, but basically it's the opposite of what we were dying before. Like if you remember the horsemen of the apocalypse, one of it is famine. So we were dying because of lack of food. No, we die because of excess of food. So actually the main cause is related to obesity. And the ocean can provide a lot of help with that. So if you talk with doctors working on obesity, they will tell you the only really documented diet that makes a difference when it comes to obesity is a seafood diet. So we need seafood. But then there's also some really cool studies that have been done by environmental psychologists showing that if you go to the sea, if you live close to the sea, you're healthier. So there is this correlation between being connected to the ocean and physical and mental health. And then there's also all these medication. I think there's only a handful of medication that are actually coming from the sea today. It's not really popular to develop new ones because it's expensive, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot of cool stuff to still be extracted there. So you have this really great movement now that's called Ocean and Human Health that was quite popular in the US, but it's developing now in Europe, where you have all these bridges between how the ocean is impacting human health, and a lot of really cool things to be investigated there. So we need the ocean in a nutshell. You know that. And you also know that, unfortunately, we are putting a lot of pressure on the ocean today, and it's difficult to completely evaluate the impact we have, but you have multiple ways of doing that. And one is this Ocean Health Index that have been developed about 15 years ago. And it's combining ecological processes with socioeconomic aspect and so on. So it's quite of a comprehensive index. And then what you can do is like a rough idea of what the situation is. And the health index is basically between 0 and 100, 100 being a perfectly healthy ocean. And on average, it's about 60%. So it's already quite under pressure. And then what you can also see is that you have variation in space. So it's not the same everywhere. Some countries, unfortunately, most of the time, developing countries are under quite a bad situation. And it's really bad because that's the places where they are the most depending on the ocean for their survival. So that means that we have this problem of multiple stressors. So it's, again, every places will have a unique combination of stressors from local to global. So you're going to have overfishing, habitat destruction, pollution, and then global changes like climate change, extreme events, warming, acidification. And the real challenge we have today is like, how do we prioritize? How do we know what are the main problems in different places and what can we actually do about it? And that's going to be really the core of what I want to talk about today. If you want to interrupt me, by the way, just go for it if something isn't clear or if you have comments. But what we know is that we put more pressure, and we also know that every species, every ecosystem has a limit. You can't push it so far. So you have a little bit of resilience, but if we push too hard, things shift. And that's the concept of ecosystem shift that you have in many places, where you move from one state of an ecosystem that is biodiverse, resilient, healthy, to another one that most of the time is not as good. And a good example of that is what you can see in Norway and in many places around the world, where you have, if you take Norway and you draw a line in the middle, if you go south, you're going to have beautiful kelp forests full of fish, full of biodiversity. If you go north, you're going to have sea urchin barrens. So that's a different types of ecosystem that's basically only sea urchin eating everything else. And what makes the difference between going from there to there is overfishing. So you remove all the top predators, no more top predator, the sea urchins just explode in number, eat everything else, and then you go to this much poorer type of ecosystem. Very easy to go from the left to the right, really hard to go from the right to the left. It's much harder to restore. So that's something to remember. So what policymakers most of the time want is they want numbers. They want to know, okay, how far can we push? What are the thresholds for acidification, for warming, for pollution, and so on? So how do we identify these tipping points? And I will try to convince you that it does not make much sense. So maybe there is another way of thinking about that. So one example of how it's done is ecotoxicology or ecophysiology, where you have a toxicant arriving in the water, and then what you do your research, you basically monitor how much of this is in the water, you make standardized experiments, and you define like the performance curve, where you have the increased concentration, dose response, and then the effect you check. And then you define the limit that is reasonable, that if it's lower than that, you don't have too much significant negative effect on whatever you care about, ecosystem or species. And then you can implement basically regulation. This is the maximum level that can be released in the water, and then you can put the regulation in action and limit industries, right? They are already, I think this is kind of scientifically based, so that's good. But there are a lot of questions that are open. For example, what's happening when you combine multiple stressors, multiple pollutants together? You have this toxicant effect, this cocktail effect. That can make it really complicated to actually have a number. So that's one approach on how you can define these thresholds. Another one could be a more political threshold, and a good example would be the Paris Agreement. In that case, there's not so much scientific basis. It's kind of a bit arbitrary. Let's put a limit at 1.5 degrees. I think we can find argument for that, but it's really weak scientifically. The point is that it doesn't seem to work really well because we are really close to cross this 1.5 if we didn't cross it already. I think you can argue, but the CO2 keeps going up, and there was this evaluation published a couple of years ago saying that at the rate we are emitting CO2 within a few years, it's not going to be possible to reach the Paris Agreement anyway. But then you have this kind of positivity in the policy sphere sometimes where they say, well, look at this beautiful projection about, okay, if we do this if we agree on this, then you have this curve that is completely going up and magically is just turning down, right? Really, really quickly based on policy agreement. The problem is that most of these policy agreements are based on things that are not existing yet, like technology for capturing carbon that are not working or not tested or not implemented yet. So you end up with a lot of policies for climate that are actually inefficient. And there was this paper also published last year saying that out of 1,500 climate policies that have been implemented, 63 were actually efficient. So that's kind of frustrating too, because it's not really going in the right direction. And the last example for that would be planetary boundaries. So that made a lot of noise also in the policy framework. So it was released the COP15 in Copenhagen many, many years ago, and it's been developed through there. It took me a long time to actually understand what these planetary boundaries means. I completely misunderstood it for many years, and I just realized a few years ago that What they want is to put limits to avoid a change in a geological era. So they want to stay in the Holocene because basically that's where humanity always lived. So they want to avoid having this shift in geological era. But thinking like this, a lot of bad things will happen before we shift geological era. Like it's going to have huge impact on fisheries, it was huge impact on many different ecosystems. And what puzzled me when I saw it the first time is that they designed one, there's one for the ocean, you know that, which was only ocean acidification, which, to be honest, I worked on acidification for 20 years. This is a big problem, but it's not the only problem that the ocean is facing, right? And also what was puzzling me is that they say, okay, we are still in the safe operating space. So I had a little bit of a look at how they define the boundary for acidification and realized the science is extremely weak behind that. So I'm working with them now to trying to make it a little bit better, but still. So to do that, just let's go back to the basics of acidification, because that's a little bit one of the reasons why I'm here also, is to work on that. So acidification is not climate change. It's another consequence of CO2 emissions. So it's very basic. There is no denial that it's happening because you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The ocean is absorbing about 1/4 of it, and then it interacts with water, turn into carbonic acid, and then you have this cascading effect on the carbonate chemistry. So basically what's happening is CO2 goes up, the bicarbonate goes up, the carbonate goes down, and the pH goes down, and then the saturation state goes down. So the saturation state is an index that will tell you if the water is corrosive or not for structure made of calcium carbonate, like coral reefs, shells of many organisms, and so on. And the way they define the planetary boundaries in the framework is 80% of the saturation. So if you go 80% below the saturation state of today, no science behind that at all. Like it's completely arbitrary too. And that, to really understand that, we have to think about what the threshold is. And the threshold is basically a limit between two states, a little bit like I mentioned, the tipping point. If you want a simpler example, water, right? You have water, liquid, if it's higher than 0, ice, if it's lower than 0. So basically, if we go back to the ocean, we had a problem with absolute threshold for acidification for the reason that we have here. If you take two different population of the same species, and that's a real case study. So if you go along the coast of Chile, and you take two populations of mussels, you bring them to the lab and you do exactly the same experiment. So you keep them in high pH, lower pH, and check what's happening. One population did terribly, like dying, basically, a lot of them dying. The other one, no effect whatsoever. So that's something that you read a lot in the literature from 10 years ago. Acidification impact is species-specific or population-specific. If you want to talk to a policymaker, this is a disaster because basically if they ask you what's going to be the impact of my favorite seafood, my favorite ecosystem, the only honest answer you can have is like, we don't really know. It depends. We don't really understand why some species are doing better than others. And if we go back to the tipping point, it's because basically we overlooked something. So remember the water, right? Liquid or solid. How do you make ice when temperature is higher than 0 degrees? I do that to my students all the time and they are petrified, which actually is a very simple answer. That's the nerdy science answer. There is a simpler one. You use a freezer. Right? So you use a freezer, and the thing is that it works, but you need energy. So if you want to remember one thing about ocean acidification is that it's not a calcification issue, it's nothing like that, it's basically energy issue. You expose an organism to more stressful conditions, and to deal with it, they have to get rid of the proton out of their body, they have to calcify in a different way, and all that costs energy. So if they have energy, they cope with it. If they don't, you start to have negative effects. And a good example of that is what's happening in the deep sea. So if you go in the deep sea close to the vents, the conditions are really dramatic. You have really high temperature. pH there is 5, basically 5 point something, right? It's never going to happen on the surface. In the surface, about 8 to 7 point something. But there it's 5. What do you find? Calcifiers. Big mussels that big, that totally fine, basically. And they are fine because they use chemosynthesis and they have access to a lot of energy there. So they are not energy limited, so they can cope with really challenging conditions. An organism, they can do that. They can have these calcification fridges inside their body where they use energy to keep the conditions right. So that's basically going back to the simplest concept of stress ecology. Stress is when you deviate from what you happy in, right? So you can actually live in really warm water, low pH water, if you adapt it to it. And the stress will just be when you deviate from that. So that was also why I could explain why some populations were doing better than others, because in some places they are adapted to a really narrow range of pH, when in the other you have a huge variability that is driven by photosynthesis, respiration, currents, and so on. So what that tells us is that there is not a single threshold for acidification. The threshold will be relative to what they are adapted to. Temperature, people got that immediately because we understand that it varies depending on what climate you are, you're going to be more or less adapted. But for pH, it took about 10 years to the community to get to that point, right? But it's the same idea. You have variation in space, you have variation in time. Organisms through evolution adapted to these conditions, meaning that for some, a small change in pH will be dramatic. For some others, it's going to be fine. It's still within the natural range. So at the time, as I said, like the literature was all about species specific, it's population specific. We don't really know why organisms are more sensitive than others. So we made an effort of trying to reanalyze the whole literature and try to see if we can explain with this idea of deviation from the natural variability. So we started with Chile again. So we collected all the papers, all the different populations, and it was a mess. Like sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, the effect of decreased pH. And we went back to all the different populations where the organisms were collected, and we monitored. So we monitored the pH at high frequencies. So in that case, we don't want to know if it's a small average change through time. We want to know every year what is the envelope of pH that the organism is experiencing. No organism cares about averages. They care about extremes. So we wanted to capture the extremes. So that was a different type of monitoring from the data we already had. So we had to capture the extremes. And then we reanalyzed all the data from the lab, taking into account the extremes. So for each experiment, the treatment that was used, how much was it deviating from the extreme they're experiencing in the field? And when you do that, all these messy kind of data put themselves really beautifully in a relationship. So this is an index telling you how far you deviate from today. So 0 means you're exactly on the extreme of today. And if you go on the right, you deviate more and more. And basically, the more you deviate, the more negatively impacted the organism is. So again, takeaway message, it's relative to what they are experiencing. So it's super important for acidification to monitor the high frequency close to where the organism live. And that's something we discussed to do here. We already have really good data for long-term trends, but maybe we need, if we want to understand the impact on biology, we need more high frequency data locally. So we wanted to test that using a distributed experiment. So the idea was we had labs all over the world working on the same species, and we picked Mytilus galloprovincialis because it's everywhere. And we designed basically a really nice protocol to do that, and then COVID happened. So we couldn't do it. So instead, we kept the people together and we reanalyzed the whole literature. And basically, that was really great because we saw the same trend that we saw just for Chile everywhere and around the world. So now we know that if you want to know the impact of acidification, you need to know how far you're going to deviate from the present range. So we have a better understanding on what makes a species sensitive or not to acidification. But still, defining threshold can be really, really complex. And this is, I'm not going to go into too much detail for that, but we try to define what is the threshold for echinoderms along the coast of California. So kind of a narrow question, right? And to cut a long story short, even focusing on one region and one group of organisms, we couldn't really agree on anything. So it's kind of challenging to really define the threshold. And the reason is that you based your threshold on experiment done in the lab. Everybody does things differently. You neglect the other parameters that actually are modulating the response. And Again, for example, that's a really cool experiment that has been done in Kiel in Germany, where they showed that the response you see, for example, in mussels, will depend on how much food you give them. So if you expose them to acidification at low food, you can see the shell getting dissolved inside. So it's really a strong negative effect. You feed them more, the solution goes away. Nothing really surprising there. It's again, the set is all about energy. It's like if you go in the polar region, you're going to have to eat more food to compensate. So a polar explorer eat 10,000 calories a day. So that's the same thing. You give the extra food to the mussel and they can cope with it. So it's complicated, right? I think it's complicated for many reasons. When it comes to acidification, you won't have one simple threshold. It's going to be relative, not absolute. Then they're going to be very locally dependent because you have to take into account the other parameters that are modulating, like food. And then you have to also understand really well the variability. So basically, what you can expect really is not one number, but it's a kind of a landscape that is incorporating all the complexity. And one of the really big question mark is multiple stressors, because, okay, you have an impact of a certain temperature. What if you change the temperature and temperature vary enormously, salinity, food concentration, pollution, and so on. So that's one of the key scientific questions to resolve. And it's complicated because I showed you before, like when it comes to toxicant, you have this sigmoid relationship. So the higher the concentration, the higher the negative effect, till you reach everything dies. pH, temperature, all of these things are natural processes. So they are not toxicants, so they are not toxic by default. So what you have most of the time in terms of response is a unimodal curve like this that is not linear. So you're going to have very complex effects. And that can lead to very confusing data. So that's a paper we did some years ago on sea urchin larvae, and we did 2 different pH and 3 different temperature. And what we showed is like if you do the experiment at low temperature, you have a positive effect of low pH, a positive effect of acidification. If you do it at mid temperature, you have no effect. And if you do it at high temperature, you have a negative effect. And actually, you can explain that by understanding these curves that I just showed you before, because depending on where you are on the curve, the effect you're going to have is going to be different. So we know that temperature and pH are additive. So they increase the dose of stress that you have inside your organisms. And so depending on where you start, you always go right. So if you decrease the pH, you go right. If you increase the temperature, you go right. So if you start in the low end of the curve and you increase the temperature, it goes up the curve. You decrease the pH, it goes also up the curve. And if you combine, it stays on that phase and you have actually a positive effect of low pH. If you start at a higher temperature, you're a little bit higher on the curve. And then basically what you see is like no effect because you go back on the other side of the curve. And then if you start much higher on the curve, you're going to have like this synergistic effect that is actually showing that the combined effect is much stronger than the individual effects, right? So you need to do really boring experiment to start with, which is understanding this curve. And a lot of scientists are not really excited about that, but it is very important. And a good example of doing it right is what Einar is doing with Kaplan here, where they made the effort of studying the effect of temperature and resolving this curve. You need this information if you want, after that, to understand the impact with pH on that species. But then it can be even worse when you have interaction. So interaction means it's not additive like this. You're just going to have complicated effects that can't be really predicted easily. Simple metaphor. If you drink a little bit, you know what's going to happen to you if you drink a beer. You know what's going to happen to you if you drink a glass of wine. And then you're probably going to know if you combine both what's going to happen too. So don't believe the myth that you have to drink wine before beer or beer before wine. That has been tested. It has zero effect. Actually, the reason why you get more hangovers is because you're mixing, and most of the time you drink lower quality of certain things. It's the quality that matters. So no additive, pay for a good booze, and then you're going to be fine. But basically, that's just because you increase the dose of alcohol in your blood. So it doesn't matter if it's beer or wine, you basically add the level of alcohol, and that's what drives the effect. But then you can have interaction if you mix alcohol with, for example, you're sick and you take some prescription drugs. And sometimes it's recommended don't drink when you take this because you're going to have interactions and that can either amplify the effect or decrease the effect of the pills you're taking. And that's also work in the ocean. So we made an experiment testing, for example, the combined effect of acidification and pollution. And in that case, it was triclosan, and we didn't pick them at random. This is because triclosan has a pKa that is quite high in pH. So basically what it means that is like if you decrease just a little bit the pH, it's doubling the concentration of the toxic form. So what we could see is that if you decrease the pH, they grow a little bit slower. So that was on brittle stars here. If you add triclosan, they grow a little bit slower. If you combine both, they die. Really strong negative effect. So in that case, that's not something you could predict by understanding one stressor at a time. You need to understand the interactions. So be careful with that, because a lot of the models that are used now in policy are just assuming additivity in a very mathematical and simple ways and ignore these nonlinear effects and this complex interaction. So what can we do, or what shall we do as scientists contributing to policy? We need to be able to provide priorities. And if you're facing that situation where you're chased by both a lion and a tiger at the same time, I know it's very unlikely, they don't even live in the same place, but let's say it happens, if you kill one of them, you're still dead, right? So that's a good example where we have two stressors, for example, in the ocean that are equally important, and you have to address both at the same time. But in some cases, you're going to face this, right? And in that case, you know exactly what your priority is. So in that case, that's what we should be able to provide to policymakers. What are your priorities? This, we need to fix it at some point, but maybe this is more urgent. And of course, everything counts, but like if it's just if you want to fix the problem before it overflows and you just focus on the tiny drop on the top, that's not great. So now you have really great frameworks. This one has been developed by IOC UNESCO in collaboration with a SCORE working group. And what we did is really define like, okay, what do we need to know if we really want to prioritize? And you have to think about three things. Exposure. So that's monitoring. You need to understand how pH is changing, temperature is changing. So that's extremely important. You just need to be really smart in the spatial and temporal resolution. Then you have the biological side is like some organisms, some ecosystem will be more sensitive than others, and that's something that you need to test in the lab. So exposure, effects, but more importantly, you also have to think about what can be done about it. Because if you identify a problem and there is no solution, that's not really necessary to spend a lot of time on it. So you also need to list what are the solutions, and then that's how you're going to define your priority list about what should be prioritized in terms of action. So, for example, this is a good example of an action that is meaningless in many ways, because if you ban plastic straws, it's not going to change anything. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but I could see like during the UNOC conference, the Macron, the French president, only talking about that. And that's a good way of actually hiding the more important issues. It's just, okay, look all the good stuff we do. We are banning single-use plastic, which is great, do that, but that's not enough. So in a way, as a scientific community, we can argue, okay, this is nice, but not enough. So it's not that only you can define what solution you can implement, but which one that are actually matter, right? Am I okay with time, or do you? Yeah, it's getting there. Yes, thanks, boss. So what can we do? I think that's also a good way of thinking. There are options. We know what to do. That's the frustrating part, is that we know what the problems are and we know what to do. And you can divide them into these categories. So that's an example for acidification or carbon-related issues. The most important thing is mitigation. Of course, we need to reduce carbon dioxide emission. That's very important, but we also know that's going to take time, that's complicated, that requires some technological and infrastructure change in society. And then you have the other ones, which are adaptation, protection of what we still have at all costs, because it's very easy to protect. It's much harder to restore, but restore is kind of another interesting approach. And then adaptation, it's adaptation at the society level. So doing things differently to minimize the impact. So we need to do both, because we need to buy the time to mitigate, and to do that, that can only be done by adaptation. So we need to define our priorities again, and it's really urgent. So we are basically on the Titanic right now, right? We are heading toward the iceberg, and we need to take the right decision and collect the right data. And scientists can be really frustrating. including myself, because we are nerds and we get really excited about things that nobody cares about. And we want to understand all the details about everything. But we don't have the luxury of doing that anymore when it comes to this topic. And unfortunately, you still see that it was a paper, like a position feature paper in Nature last year. And you always end up with, we need more research. Yes, but not everything is important. And that's why I think the big paradigm shift that we should have, and that's what we're going to try to implement here, is really provide concrete recommendation about what science is the most urgent to do to really optimize our chance to actually drive the changes we need to save the ocean. So again, like that's a metaphor that a colleague of mine used. He said, we are on the Titanic right now. We know the problem is in front of us, and what we do is describe every cabin on the boat in tiny details. That's not helping anything, of course. You should better try to find another way, another course. But I don't want to end on a negative note. So I'm going to end on the positive note and show you cases where it actually worked. Like 2 cases, one from pollution, one from acidification, where there's been a really healthy link between different stakeholders leading to positive change. And then I will end with just showing the strategy that we will try to implement together with Ron and the others here. First example is what happened in the US in 2007. So in 2007, what they realized is that the oyster farmer on the West Coast could not produce their spat. So the way they work is they collect oysters in the field, go in the lab, spawn them, produce little larvae, let them settle, produce the spat, and then put the spat outside in cages and grow them. That year, most of them could not produce spats. And it happens in one hatchery is that it's collapsing at some point, but most time it's a disease, it's something like that. But there it was everywhere, and they didn't understand what was happening. So that was the real cause was identified by a researcher over there, and it was ocean acidification. So that was one of the first documented impact of acidification on an industry. So the cause, CO2 emissions, that was quite obvious. All the different actors could be easily identified, the industry for when it comes to the emissions, but also the oyster farmer. Policy is important to have the funding to do the research, implement adaptation change, the public. They needed the public support to support the policy changes, and the scientists. So the solutions were 2 options. One was, okay, let's reduce carbon dioxide emission. That's not a real solution because the time scale is wrong. So that would take decades, and these poor oyster farmers, they don't have decades. They need to act right now to have a production the year after. So the idea, okay, we need to buy time, so the real solution would be adaptation. Can we help them to culture oysters differently to ensure that they will have a production next year? To do that, money was needed. So there has been a big campaign to get citizen support, so press release, the farmers went in the street, like wrote stories and so on. It became like a big story that attracted the interest of policymakers. So the governor of California went in the field, talked to the farmers and said, okay, I'm going to put a commission and develop some funds to see what can be done. Part of that developed like an action plan for research. And the research was, okay, what can we do to basically restore the oyster production? And one paper in particular made a huge impact. So what they realized is that actually oysters are fine most of the time under acidification, except for 15 hours. When they move from the larvae that is just free swimming to the larvae developing a shell. If you keep them in good conditions for the 15 hours, they are fine for the rest. So that was basically a very easy trick. During that period, worse in closed system where you control the chemistry of the ocean really well. And once you're out of this window, that is difficult, then you can continue working as you usually do. That has been implemented. There are other options that were discussed, and they are back into business. So adaptation, collaboration between all the different actors, and they are back into business for now. So that's not going to work forever, because at some point the oysters won't be able to cope with whatever is outside, like when they're in the cage. But that gives time for the other solution, which was mitigation. Another story, and you're going to think I'm obsessed with oysters, but they have another problem over there. So that's the oyster farmer. They culture the Hong Kong oyster that is really big. It's like that big. And when I saw that first on the poster when I was in China, I thought it was photoshopped, but they really are like this. It's blue inside. So if you open it, they can turn completely bright blue, and that's because of copper contamination. So it's so polluted with heavy metal, and they accumulate, and they can actually survive, which is fascinating. They can actually survive this. But of course, nobody can eat this, right? So they can't, they're just traditional farmers. They couldn't at the time basically sell their products. So again, losing their job, losing their income and so on. And the problem was extreme pollution, also very difficult to solve at the beginning because that's mega cities in China and so on. But there's been a real will by the politics in Hong Kong and in China to fix the issue. So again, a nice, healthy collaboration between science, the public policy and industry. And in that case, they said, okay, let's clean the water. And they developed an amazing system in Hong Kong. So it's a massive investment of a plant that is recycling, removing the heavy metal and so on. And it reached to the point that it's so clean that people can actually go back and swim into the sea today. So that's a different kind of solution that requires a little bit of a dictatorship, but it worked. When Chinese put their mind to something, they really do it. And it was a massive investment, but now the water is clean and the farmer can sell their story again, their oyster again. So as a framework, we have examples showing how it can work. You can have problems. An example here that I will give you for climate change, acidification, and pollution. So you have different sources. So it could be a source of pollution, CO2 leading to climate change and acidification. So if we increase one or the other, that will have a negative effect on biodiversity. What we don't really know really well is the black box of the multiple stressors. As I told you, it's complicated, it's nonlinear, you have interactions. We don't really understand really well what's happening there. But what we know is that if you decrease biodiversity, you decrease resilience, and you have this negative feedback loop. So the negative effect of the other things is getting even worse, so it can lead to this ecosystem shift. So what can we do? I think, again, easy. We can decrease the pollution, mitigation, we can decrease CO2 emissions, or we can increase biodiversity or maintain biodiversity and resilience. So that's where you have the different, and then you can have also a positive loop. Like we can basically turn the negative loop into a positive loop. So basically it's again mitigation for these two and mitigation and adaptation to maintain or increase biodiversity. And you have this long array of different things that are there that we can do. And that's, as I said, think about solutions. So you can see in the list of solutions which one are readily available for you. Some of them are specific. So for example, the one for mitigation of pollution and climate change will be specific to those. So you can find new technology to capture carbon. You can have techniques to remove it from the water. And then you have the non-specific solutions, that things that we can more or less implement right now. So protected, such the right ecosystem, restore some of the ecosystem, if it's done right, can work on other stressors, work on local adaptation and so on. So the whole point of what I talked about today is that it's very dangerous to provide a number because you're going to be wrong, for sure. You're going to be wrong because it's complicated, because of multiple stressors, because of the lack of science. And the danger when you provide a threshold is that probably society will try to push as close as possible to the threshold, right? So industries don't want to slow down CO2 emissions. They will try to push as far as possible. But because of all this complexity, we for sure underestimate what the thresholds are. So that means we're going to cross the line for sure. So that's basically the idea. So maybe there is another way of thinking about like these changes and focusing on solutions and try not obsess about the number, but do the maximum we can do with the resources we have today. And again, there's a ton of recommendation of what can be done. And it's not only involving science, policy, and so on. You also have socioeconomic aspect, implementation of certain solution and so on. But that will require working together. And that's what we were at the ministry yesterday with Vernd, and that's what we said. We need to break the silos. We need to have a really clear working together approach where we have to listen as scientists. I have to listen to all the different stakeholders, the citizen, the industry, and so on. And really identify why the solutions that we know exist are not implemented. Is it because of lack of data? Let's collect those data. Is it because of lack of support from the public? Let's communicate better. Is it because of lack of understanding from policymakers? Let's work on that. So basically identify what are the solutions, why they are not implemented, and at the end, what can we do to solve this? So what the plan is for the ocean acidification gang here is basically to work on what are the important things for Iceland. what are the main services that the ocean is providing for Icelandic people, and what among those, which one are threatened by acidification. From there, okay, we have these multiple problems. What are the solutions that we can implement, and really be honest about it? Is it scalable? Is it efficient? What is limiting their implementation? What could facilitate their implementation? And how close are we to actually be able to do that? Because if the answer is like in 40 years, maybe we should, as a tiger example, let's focus on something else. Then we're also going to make a list of all the amazing stuff you already have. So you have a lot of data, you have beautiful infrastructure. So let's capitalize on what you have and also identify what the needs are. So we can always do better, but and all of that will link to basically when we put all the pieces of the puzzle together, identifying the scientific priorities. So how can we do monitoring better to actually address these needs? What kind of biological science do we need to actually do that? So hopefully that's urgent. So we're going to work really hard and try to, next time we can maybe give you an update about what we've done. But the point is like, okay, it's about working together. It's about breaking the silos. It's about listening. It's about communicating. So I'm really excited and scared to be here because it's a massive task, but that's going to be fun, I think. So I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity, and hopefully have the chance to talk with you much more in the next time I come. I'm leaving tomorrow. Thank you, guys.
Oh, it's not working. Yeah, it's working. Thank you very much for a very nice talk. Personally, I found it quite transboundary. It's not only about ocean acidification. We can learn a lot from you, not only on that, but on a lot of different matters. I mean, one, for example, is wine selection. Good wines are important. Do you have questions for Sam? Yep, Lisa.
Hi, thank you for an excellent talk. I was just curious, I have two questions. The first one was, how do you calculate ocean health? I thought that was very interesting on one of your slides. And the second one was about Hong Kong. How were they able to clean? Seeing all of those massive buildings, and all of a sudden it's so clean you can swim in it.
Yeah. So for the first question, I think I don't. Oh, sorry, good day. I don't clean the water. I don't calculate this, but it's a guy called Halpern. So they basically have a beautiful website where they explain all the methodology. But it's a combination of science, societal aspect like economic sensitivity. So it's cultural aspects. So they basically cover a wide range of different impacts that the ocean has. Not only in terms of biodiversity, but really also impact on humans and services emission. But it's a complicated index, but it's an ongoing project. So I think the first time they published it was 2008. But every year you have an update. So if you drop me an email, I will send you the link to the website. And the second question was about Hong Kong. Yeah, they basically reinvented their depuration system. So the whole, because it's a massive, really, I mean, it's insane. Hong Kong, it's really big, a lot of people living in a small place, but they basically redid all the depuration system. So it got better because it's diluted in the water, but it's really nothing like much less is entering the system. But that was a massive investment. I don't remember the cost, but it was really, really a lot of money. Yeah. But I was in China recently, and they said China is great because in the sense that if they have a good idea, they will really do it. If they have a bad idea, they will also do it. So that's the dark side. They said like the one-child policy is a good example of a terrible idea that they went through for a really long time.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the talk. I think mine is more like a comment rather than a question, but I just about your last slide about the plans to do here and this idea of basically optimizing the monitoring. I think this is crucial. I always say that Iceland has, the ratio between square kilometers of ocean and number of people is like really skewed. We have here, we are a tiny number of people and amount of resources versus the amount of the amount of area that we're supposed to keep our eyes on. And we've been talking forever about ecosystem surveys and how do we maximize the benefit of the time that we are at sea. So I think this goes, of course, beyond just like monitoring for ocean acidification. It's basically everything. And I need that some things that we have been doing it since then, right, 1950s or something, in the same way, and that we really need to just like build up from scratch our monitoring system to get all the information that we need to monitor the status of the ocean. So I'm hoping that this is the acidification topic is basically like the starter of this process that will take us to really figure out how we obtain the maximum amount of information from the resources that we have. Yeah.
That's a really good point. It's about optimizing resources, but it's also important to have a real question. And that's a little bit what I was trying to say, is like if you know why you do it, and you can do it for many different reasons. So for example, for acidification, you can measure it to identify long-term trends that would require quite heavy technology, like the quality, the standards, and so on. This is hard and it's expensive. As a biologist, I don't need that. So the monitoring I need would require much cheaper technology that you can actually implement in a lot of different places and collect high resolution data, and the quality can be lower. I don't really care. So that's, that's the thing, is that optimizing, okay, if you have a pot of money and you have a question, then you know what kind of technology you can use. And for biodiversity, you have a lot of new techniques now that are available. So if you have the right tool for the right question, but I think it's a good point. It's not keep doing things traditionally because that's what you used to do. It's more like, okay, that works really well for something. So that doesn't mean you have to stop and you can continue, but it's also like, okay, maybe let's reevaluate why we do these things. And and that's basically going to be, I think the discussion we're going to have is going to be about, okay, what are the most urgent data we need for a certain purpose? So it's probably going to require larger spatial variability, evaluation of the spatial variability at a different scale. So that's, we can check what kind of technology is there. But it's exciting to do that. Yeah.
You can see that we are already trying to pull you into a full permanent position. More questions? Yeah.
Just to respond with Handan from MFRI, for those online, just to respond to what Julian was saying. So the plan is, yes, we are doing this strategy with Sam, and it's a huge opportunity. I called you hvalreki the other day. You're like a dead whale washed up on the shore. It's an Icelandic term. That's a good thing. You don't smell that bad, but it's a hvalreki. It's really great to get someone this, at this level, because you really need to think about things in depth. What we do, how we do it, and should we continue to do it the same way? And, we need to be brave enough to do it, because it's hard to change something you've been doing for 42 years or whatever. But we're going to start with the ocean acidification. I mean, there we're not really going to change anything we're doing already. It's more like adding on. And this is going to be quite exciting work happening this autumn with Sam leading that. But then we're actually next year planning to kind of look at the whole environmental measurements we're doing for the ocean in particular in the beginning. Maybe the freshwater will come in later. Are we, doing the right things for modern needs? Because these are all programs that were designed for needs 50, 40 years ago, right? Are modern needs the same? Are we doing the right things for the modern needs or the future needs even? Should we change anything, or do we need to add on? Can we take out one station here and add another there in the monitoring system, and so on and so forth? And it's challenging work, because you really need to really think about what you're doing. You're not going to change anything half-heartedly or without good information. But it's going to be a kind of trial of the concept of this strategy that we're going to start with on ocean acidification, probably multiple stressors included in that.
Because for me, the reason why I got excited with talking with Vernd is because I was excited 5 years ago when the UN decade for the ocean started. It was, the motto was the science we need for the ocean we want. And it was all about co-creation and co-design, and people keep talking about doing it, but it's not happening. It's really theoretical still after 5 years. We are halfway through. And when I talked to her, she said, yeah, but Iceland is probably a place where it can happen. And we had quite a lot of support yesterday. I think it's possible to actually be an example, lead by example here. And we put ourselves like a deadline for next year, because there will be a big conference on acidification, and we want to go there and show what we are trying to do and say, okay, this is a country where we take that seriously. And I'm really frustrated that my home country now is not doing it. We were predicting really negative effects in 2008, and it happened. So all the science we did was for nothing because no action were taken. So I really hope that this is an opportunity to actually do it for real.
And I think I want to ask you in relation to that. We had a guest lecturer here last week talking about AMOC. Now you are talking about ocean acidification, and you have two things in common, that you have worked for IPCC, you know, advising scientists, policymakers. And I asked him a question, and I'm going to ask you the same question. I believe there is a tipping point in the people that we are electing for high offices, you know, places, rulers, leaders. There's a tipping point there. Are you optimistic that the science and the advice that we are giving are going to be, you know, listened to, or do you think?
That's an excellent question. So yeah, I got frustrated with the IPCC work or going to COP meeting. I think I've been doing a lot of those. I don't think it makes a huge difference. And the reason is that information does not drive change. The IPCC is 10,000 pages. You know, it's a huge, I think it's more the weight of evidence. This is what we know. Once for fun, I asked in a scientific conference, did anyone here ever read the IPCC report? And we had 1 out of 1,000 people raising his hand. It was Dick Feely from Washington. I didn't read it. I think I just Googled and, you know, I go through it and check for keywords. So I don't, if information was driving change, we would have fixed climate already. So I don't think this is the right tool. What we propose is do it the other way around. Is instead of doing the science supply paradigm where we do a science, we pass it to the world and hope for the best, is go and listen. Go to the policymakers and say, okay, this is what needs to happen. What would convince you to actually do it? And then do that. And that's what works really well, for example, for communication. Like we did that. We sent people in the street and say, okay, what do you care about in the ocean? And then you create an emotional response, a responsibility. You feel connected. So I think it's not about the weight of information, it's about the right information. And that's a little bit what we try to do. Try to go and listen to the policymakers and say, okay, what would convince you? Or why are you not doing it right now? Is it because of lack of data? Then it's fine, let's do that. But if it's not the lack of data, then you try to understand what is limiting. Is it communication? Is it money? Is it, you know, it can be many different factors. But I'm not a big believer in IPCC report will change the world. I think it's just increasing every time, and it's the same kind of. I think the phrasing is for acidification, they are virtually certain. That's the highest level of certainty. So what else do you want? I mean, that's. But let's take the example of here. If I come to anyone in Iceland and say, if we don't cut CO2 emissions, sea urchin larvae will decrease their growth by 25%. Nobody cares. But if I say, okay, your favorite species of fish is actually not only decrease in number, but tastes terrible. And you won't be able to sell it for these reasons. That's increasing your probability of actually having action, I suppose. So that's also what we're going to do. That's in my last list of it there. It was like, let's identify what are the important things and focus on that. Yes. Good answer?
So what triggers the people to start?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think this is the last point. Thank you very much.
Thank you.